Hey everybody, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Mark Aoyagi. Mark, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
I'm so super excited to have you on the Sports Psych Show. Before we get started, I know a lot of people out there will know who you are and your fantastic work within American sport. But to get us started, tell us a little bit about you and your work.
Well, I guess to take that in two parts, a bit about me, I always say, first and foremost in my life, I'm a husband, I'm a father. So my family has always been my priority, and try and keep that aligned with my values and who I am as a person. So that's kind of the you side of me, I suppose. As a professional, kind of the other part of my life or aspect of my life is, and that actually splits into kind of two pieces as well. One is I have kind of a home base at the University of Denver, where I'm a co-director along with Jamie Shapiro of the master's program in sport and performance psychology. So we've been going strong there about I think 17 years now, 18 years now, something like that. Have some wonderful colleagues, Audra Parchadovsky, Bree Jones Copeland, and just added a new person to our mix, Iman Hassan. So super excited about that. So I have kind of the academic piece, and then I have a practice as well, which our faculty colleagues all have a shared practice, but we do pretty different things. So my trajectory has kind of been moving from during my training and early part of my career, a lot in college sports here in the U.S. and a lot of different college athletic departments, and then worked with USA Track and Field. That was kind of simultaneous with the collegiate piece. And then the last, probably 15 years or so has been primarily in professional sport with the Denver Nuggets, which is professional basketball, and then the Denver Broncos, which is professional football, then the Los Angeles Dodgers, which is professional baseball, and now I'm with both the Dodgers and the Denver Broncos.
You're a busy man.
It sounds a lot when I say it out loud, but it doesn't feel too bad. So,
Well, you're skirting those worlds of academia and applied practice, and I'm really interested to dive into that. In terms of your academic work, are you just teaching? Are you researching? What does that look like from a sort of a day-to-day, week-to-week basis?
yeah. So for my interests and passions, which really is on the application of the science, it's a perfect fit. So we're in what's called the Graduate School of Professional Psychology, and so if you break that down, it's graduate students, not undergraduate students, which I enjoy because they're focused, they're motivated, they've sort of picked a passion and a pathway, and so they're invested. And then the professional piece is that we kind of joke that it's professionals, not amateurs, but what it really means is that it's practitioners, not researchers. And so we use what's called a scholar practitioner model. I'm sorry, a practitioner scholar model. And so it's training practitioners, not training scientists. The scholarship part of that is we want them to be practitioners that are rooted in science and can understand science, but aren't necessarily producing science. So it's very much applied focus. Our graduates are going on to become mental performance consultants. There's also a licensure track so they can do some mental health work. But the role is teaching, supervision, mentoring, things of that nature.
You're doing so much applied work, Mark, and I'm keen to unpack how you go about what you do and unpacking some of the crucial mental skills that you coach players and helping coaches listening in to understand those. But I'd be keen to learn a little bit more about the training that you do of young sports psychologists. I mean, what do you think makes a great sports psychologist? What approaches are you trying to train into those sports psychologists, young practitioners when they start with you?
So there's one skill in particular. So it's funny, in a couple of weeks here, we'll have our orientation, and I kind of do a little, I don't know, production, I guess you would say, to orient them to graduate school, orient them to our program, kind of set the tone for the culture of our program. And I asked them in the beginning of the conversation what they think will be the most important knowledge, skill, or attribute that will get them through graduate school and into the profession. And I asked them, to kind of reflect on that and note it. And then I go through kind of my piece that leads to hopefully the idea, kind of the pieces build towards that. What I reveal in the end what I believe to be the most important skill, which is curiosity. And, kind of the point of the presentation is that I feel like a good practitioner has more questions than answers, and curiosity is what drives that process. And so that kind of underpins both my philosophy in terms of education as well as in terms of application.
Is curiosity a skill that has developed in your own practice? Do you think you came to the world of sports psychology with a natural curiosity?
Well, you've activated my academic mindset a little bit. So, to use a little bit of nerdy language here, I believe there's both a trait and a state quality to it. And so, the trait quality would be, perhaps a little bit more inborn, maybe something gifted by your parents. And the state quality, which is so just to differentiate, trait is kind of your natural proclivity towards a particular characteristic, and then state is how much of that particular characteristic you might be displaying in any particular moment. And so I feel like I do have a pretty high trait level of curiosity. One of my best friends growing up, he used to call me 20 questions. And so that was, I think that was indications of an early proclivity towards curiosity. And some of it's my background as well. I don't know how much of that we want to get into, but just for flavor of the conversation, my parents both immigrated to the U.S. So my mom is from England originally, from Birmingham, and my dad is from Japan. And so two immigrants, very different home cultures, and then I was born in the United States and raised in a third culture. And so, a lot of that led to probably confusion first, which then I think was reinforced by curiosity. So, anyways, that's a long way of saying that I do feel like I have a sort of innate quality of curiosity, but I have also sought to develop it as a skill as well, and tried to increase the innate capacity that I have.
There's worse nicknames than 20 questions, Mark.
Well, I've
There's
had
worse.
some of those too.
Yeah, there's worse things to be called. Hey, look, in your world, you're straddling between almost three areas. You know, as an academic sports psychologist, you're working with players, you're working with coaches. I just want to pause on this word curiosity. Do you think in your work with coaches and players, I would imagine you would suggest that curiosity is important for coaches. Do you think it's important for players as well? I've often heard some people talk about there are great coaching mindsets, great player mindset, and some people think that the less players think, the better. What's your thought on curiosity outside of performance psychology into the coaching and the playing world?
Well, it's a little bit of an interesting juxtaposition you introduced there at the end between thinking and curiosity,
Yeah,
because I would actually suggest that at least the way that I experience and describe curiosity is it's not thinking; it's experiential. And so I think it is a hugely beneficial for players. I'll draw another parallel here, which is not 100% overlap, but closely related between curiosity and mindfulness. And a great quote that I love is that if you are mindful, or when you're in the state of mindfulness, boredom cannot exist. And so I think that's a really interesting mindset for athletes to adopt as they go through practices, which can be very routinized, very repetitive by design, right? And therefore can be perceived as boring. But the state of mindfulness is an openness to the wonder of each unfolding moment. And I would suggest that curiosity has a lot of overlap with that. In fact, they're probably mutual drivers of one another. And so the more that you can activate mindfulness, the more that you can activate curiosity, the more connected you're going to be in practice. And then, of course, the hope being that the more connected you are in practice, the more successful you'll be in the competition.
something you said there was very interesting that practice can be repetitive, but do you think that a hallmark of a great coach is to combat that repetitiveness, is to be a creative coach, is for a coach to be somebody who brings something novel to the table every day?
Well, again, I'm not sure that repetitiveness and creativity are at odds, because there is so. I mean, not to try and cut these words too finely, but in many sports, I'm hesitant to always draw
Yeah.
broad strokes, but in many sports, there's a repetitive quality to whatever the skill is that you're trying to produce, and so obviously there's a necessity to doing that in practice. Now, I think probably what you're getting at, and what I would agree with, is the idea that coaches can produce an environment where the mindset and the experience is sort of the idea of you never step in the same river twice. And so while the actions, the physical movements, maybe even the mental focal points are repetitive, the experience of them profoundly unique. And again, that's the idea of mindfulness, and I think that's a quality to practices that coaches can promote.
Mindfulness something that you utilize in your work with players and coaches?
Yeah, it's the backbone of a lot of my work for sure.
And is that something that you're teaching every single coach or player, or are you a little bit more discriminate than that?
Again, it's an interesting question when you start to think about these things because I would say, in terms of if we talk about formal mindfulness, then no, I'm not teaching that to every single person that I work with. If we talk about the mind state, the attitude of mindfulness, then yeah, I think that that's at least implicit, if not explicit, in everybody that I work with.
And when we off air, we were having a conversation about what we could talk about. You introduced me to an area of research that's of interest to you, and actually, you've written co-written a book on this, and that's a theoretical orientation to performance excellence. And I know your book is, I believe, oriented towards sports psychologists, but I'd like to hone in on that a little bit. That excites me. The notion of a theoretical orientation towards performance excellence. That really, really interests me. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that with you. Can you sort of introduce that topic to me?
Yeah, so the backstory on it is for those that have an understanding of psychology in general. Um, so I went from my training prep path was I did an undergrad in exercise and sports science that was a sports psychology program, and then this was in no way this planful, but it ended up working out very well. I did a second major in psychology, and so I had kind of both aspects of the profession in undergrad, which is very unique, and also had a sports psychology practitioner, Keith Henshin,
Wow.
a great mentor of mine that was at my undergrad at the University of Utah, and that was my introduction to sports psychology. So very, very fortunate in that regard. None of that was planned. And then went on to do a master's in kinesiology with a sports psychology emphasis at Georgia Southern, and that was the plan. That was to get the master's and then go take over the world as a sports psychology consultant. And I soon realized that at Georgia Southern, fantastic training, learned all of sort of the book concepts, but I found that for me personally and my personality, I didn't have the skill to then go sit one on one with a person and convey that. So you've used the word teaching a few times, and my understanding was that yeah, this would just be go teach people mental skills, and then a brief divergence here. The first client that I had, the first one-on-one client that I had, was an athlete that was coming back from injury. So I'm like, oh, injury, perfect. I know what to do. Visualization until they can physically practice. So I asked this athlete to join me in a visualization session. And about a minute into the visualization session, tears start streaming down her
Yeah.
face. Eyes are closed. I'm observing this, grad student. What the hell do I do? I mean, this is my internal, dialogue or monologue or whatever. So, I don't know what I'm doing. So I continue on. I finish out the visualization session and, ask her to open her eyes. And I'm like, how was that? And, she's emotional. And anyways, long story short, her fear was that her injury was going to be career ending. And so the visualization just brought out all of that emotion that she might not ever be able to physically play again. So I share that story just to illustrate that I was not equipped to handle that situation. I'm not suggesting that everybody is not. There are some people that again have more of that innate compassion and emotional intelligence that I did not have. I was kind of your classic, you know, socialized into sport and all of the emotional numbness that comes with that. So, um, so again, a long way of getting to the fact that after my master's in kinesiology, I realized that I needed to add counseling psychology skills. That's what I needed to be the type of practitioner that I wanted to be. So went on to do a doctorate in counseling psychology at the University of Missouri. And again, for anybody that has a psychological background, you'll be very familiar that once you get into a psychology training program, you're constantly hammered with what's your theoretical orientation. You need to develop your theoretical orientation. And in that context, it's talking about, psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral theory, things of that nature in a mental health setting. And I soon realized that, well, wait a minute, I've learned all of these skills in sports psychology, mental performance skills from my master's program in sports psychology, but I've never learned this idea of a theory that holds it all together. Why is that? And so as that idea sort of germinated and developed over my time in the counseling psychology program, I sort of committed to once I get out of my training and start my professional career, I'm really interested in wanting to bring this idea of theoretical orientation to sports psychology. So not a new idea, but perhaps a new domain in which to apply it. And and even in that regard, the traditional psychological mental health theories had been brought into sports psychology. But what I wanted to do was say, well, look, why don't we have a theoretical orientation to performance excellence? That's what makes our profession unique, right? It's not the mental health piece that with people that happen to be athletes. It's the focus on performance excellence and helping people develop the psychological and emotional skills to be at their best when it matters most. So that's the whole idea behind it. And so what we did with the book is because there was not an existing literature on this topic, we wanted to take a really naturalistic, qualitative approach to getting the preeminent practitioners of the time. And it was really a beautiful time to do this because you had sort of the first generation of applied sports psychologists, with the very notable exception of Dr. Bruce Ogilvy, who trained many of the folks that are in the book. But Bruce had passed away, but with again with his notable exception, basically the first generation of, I don't know, call it preeminent practitioners in the profession were still with us. And so Keith Henshin, Ken Revizza, Rich Gordon, Gloria Balagay, and Marta Penskard, Sean McCann, all, the legends in our field, all were both with us and willing to contribute to the book. And so what we asked them to do is basically in their own voice. So we very much wanted to preserve their voices as well. In fact, our original working title for the book was The Chronicle of Theories of Applied Sports Psychology, because we wanted it to be almost an anthology of the voices of these original practitioners. And so we kind of gave them the prompts of, one, give us a little bit of your background and how you came into sports psychology, so an autobiographical sketch. And then we asked them to describe their theoretical orientation to performance excellence, how, what pieces they feel like are important to that. And then their theoretical orientation to performance breakdowns, what goes wrong. Their consulting approach, how they bring that into their work with athletes and performers, any unique features that they may have. And, a lot of them push back at that, of the idea of there's nothing really unique. We're just kind of reusing ideas that we've learned from one another and so forth. But that was the book. And so it was really just capturing those insights from, again, the preeminent practitioners in our field.
Without a framework underpinning what you do, it's very difficult to approach your cases from a consistent perspective, isn't it?
For sure. And my argument would be that's what differentiates a professional from a person that just happens to be able to give good advice. Or even from, so a lot of our colleagues would say that coaches are sports psychologists. And I very much appreciate the sentiment, and I respect coaches 100%. My brother is a coach. One of my other professional mentors, Rick McGuire, his primary professional role was as a coach, and he was also a sports psych consultant. So very much respect the role of coaches. Coaches have a living laboratory that any sports psychology consultant would kill for, right? They have people that are, quote unquote, required to do the things that they ask of them, and then they get feedback and if it works or not. And so coaches have great insights on human behavior. But what I would say differentiates it, and this is where the theoretical orientation comes in, is that the luxury that we have as sports psychology consultants is we're focused only on that mental and emotional piece. And of course, coaches have the technical, the tactical, the spiritual, the physical. I mean, they're responsible for everything, right? So we have just this one piece to focus on. And from that focus, then we can draw broader generalizations. So typically, a lot of my experiences with the coaches are, let's say an athlete is faltering in confidence, and the coach will have, okay, I've seen this with other athletes, or I experienced this myself as an athlete, and I know how to address this. But if it doesn't happen to connect with that athlete's personality or that athlete's unique context, then the coach might have maybe another tool to pull, but they don't have, they haven't had the luxury of understanding, well, what are the unique life experiences that are contributing to the way that this particular athlete is experiencing this particular bout of lack of confidence. And that's where the theoretical orientation come in, is to color in some of those broad brushstrokes. And then through the filter of that, through the prism of that theoretical orientation, then you layer in the individual that particular person. And again, that's the purpose of the theoretical orientation, but it's also the privilege of our profession to focus in on just that one piece.
It's interesting, Mark, 'cause you made me think of having been a sports psychologist for 18 years. I've been confronted is probably the wrong word, but let me go with it. Confronted with a coach saying to me, "I'm the sports psychologist," and I've always my response to that kind of comment tends to be, "Well, look, absolutely yes, you do psychology in your role as a coach every single day. In fact, you could argue that psychology is omnipresent; it's always there, it's constantly there." And
No doubt.
I believe, and I think general consensus would be many of the world's greatest coaches, historically and now, happen to be very naturally adept at managing, influencing human behavior. They do great psychology within their role as a coach, but they're not sports psychologists per se for all of the reasons that you've put forward. And just to add one more thing before I'm sure you'll provide a comment back, is that the way I also describe it is that my father was a London taxi driver for 50 years. Now, you ask a Londoner who drives consistently through London, get me
Mm.
from King's Cross to Westminster, they could probably tell you how to do that. My father, having been a taxi driver for 50 years, could tell you 10 different routes. If you get stuck in traffic, he knows which minor roads to go down and which shortcuts are available at different
Mhm.
times during the day. I think that's a useful analogy to think of the sports psychologist having lots of different approaches and avenues towards a single challenge that maybe a coach might not have.
Yeah, that's a beautiful analogy, and it makes a lot of sense. And I would even say that a coach in that analogy, to maybe torture the analogy a little bit, is a professional driver. And so they're much more educated on how to make that
Yeah.
traverse than your average driver, but probably not as much as a taxi driver. And so, again, to sort of double down on the respect that I have for coaches, I've learned a ton from coaches
Yes.
about
Yes.
psychology, right? So again, we're not saying that, and I think neither one of us is saying that coaches don't have any say or any skill in this area. It's just that, again, and again, I would say even in, gosh, I'm sure there's times when coaches would have a better approach to sports psychology than I would with a particular individual. But do they have the time to sit down with that individual and focus on just that piece? Again, they've got so many things on their plate, so many things that they're responsible for. And so that's where, sports psychologists can both learn from coaches, but also serve as a great relief for coaches that, again, we have the luxury to focus just on that one piece.
Given that you've written the book, Theoretical Orientation to Performance Excellence, or in short, TOPE, TOPE, it would be crazy of me not to tease out of you your own personal TOPE. How do you go about doing what you do with the incredible array of clients that you have?
Well, so a lot of my TOPE was informed by both the process of the book and, as I've alluded to, many coaches that I've worked with.
Yeah.
So, the trick is to always try and capture as much as you can of performance excellence without trying to be exhaustive, because then it becomes useless if you've got, 27 pieces in there. So I kind of narrowed it down to three elements, and they happen to work into this nice acronym FIT. And so I ended up kind of branding, I guess you would say, my theoretical approach as mental fitness with the FIT capitalized. And so that's focus, inspiration, and trust. So those are kind of the bedrocks, and then I can go into more detail if you would like.
I'd love you to unpack those piece by piece if you'd be okay with doing that.
Yeah, sure. So focus I use as a very broad umbrella, right? If we go into the scientific literature of sports psychology, there would be this differentiation between focus and concentration, and all of these types of things. I'm using focus as just a broad umbrella to capture how do you use your mind, basically. So I would view, so going back to lack of confidence, for example, I would view, at least initially as a starting point, I would conceptualize that as an inappropriate focus. So for me, under focus, skills like obviously attention would fall, concentration would fall, um, things like how you relate to yourself or not would fall. All of that for me would fall under focus. And then the sort of the approach I take to both teaching and understanding focus broadly, again, would be mindfulness. So very much of the philosophy of more of an acceptance based approach as opposed to what might be called a control based approach. It's sort of a ability to be aware of your focus. So I view awareness as one of the tent poles within that, and then attentional control as the other tent pole. So being aware of where your mind is, and then being able to use your mind in an appropriate way. So that's broad brushes on the focus.
Fascinating in terms of breaking down focus. Do you find that the work you do, let's say, and respecting confidentiality here, but the work you do in basketball from a focus perspective is similar to what you might do in the NFL, or are there subtle or obvious differences there?
So the skill is going to be the same, right? And attention to me, focus to me, is a very trainable skill. And I use a lot of Nidafer's work. So the idea that we have kind of these two dimensions. One would be broad or narrow. One would be internal or external.
Yep.
And then I also think about um, the so there's the direction of the focus,
Yep.
to use Nidafer's word. There's the breadth of the focus, and then there's also this piece of the meta awareness, and that's more of kind of the mindfulness perspective. Do you know where your attention is at any given point, and then do you have the skill to get it to where you need to be? And then the other piece, this comes directly from Keith Henson in my undergrad training. He talks about the most important skill is being able to switch. And so so broad strokes, all of that training would be the same for a basketball player or a football player, but the application of that would be different for the basketball player and the football player. And even within basketball and football would be dependent on what are the tasks of the particular position or the particular assignment that that person has. That's going to define how they use their attention. But the broad strokes training would be the same.
The pace of the game in NFL, the in and out nature of it, obviously different to that of a basketball player. Obviously respecting timeouts and quarterly breaks, but as you say, the way focus of attention play out will be different. And certainly in basketball, I always think. I mean, I do plenty of work in soccer, football here in England, and
Sure.
the importance of focus of attention probably resting more often than not externally, searching for cues, clues, triggers
Mhm.
as they emerge and dissolve during the game. But I would imagine that's something in play that NFL players have to accommodate for as well. I just want to dwell on this just
Yeah.
for a second before we go on to the next area of your taupe, inspiration. Are there typical challenges you find from a focus of attention perspective in basketball or football?
So I appreciate the question and the opportunity to expand on this a little bit, because there is a key piece that I didn't talk about yet, which is, and this will answer your question. So there's another framework that I like to use when I introduce these concepts, and this comes from Jim Lair, and it's the idea that there's four markers of fitness: strength, endurance, flexibility, resilience. But there's also four domains of fitness. So when I say those markers of fitness, strength, endurance, flexibility, and resilience, a lot of people probably tend to put muscular or physical in front of those, right? Muscular strength, muscular endurance, muscular flexibility, muscular resilience. So that's one of the markers of fitness. I'm sorry, one of the domains of fitness would be physical, but there's also mental, there's also emotional, and there's also spiritual.
Mm.
And the thing is that those same four markers of fitness apply to all of those domains. So physically, we have this understanding that if you want to train muscular strength, there's oftentimes going to be a trade-off with endurance and a trade-off with flexibility. But the physiologist will tell you specific training for specific results. So specificity is very important. So then you go to the mental and the emotional categories, which of course is my sweet spot. And I'll say, okay, so if we say mental strength, well, okay, a lot of athletes have a pretty good idea of that. In fact, that might be the only idea that they have. But if you say mental endurance, if you say mental flexibility, if you say mental resilience, how do you train those things? Right? Do you have a plan for that? Do you have specificity for that? And that applies to both athletes and also coaches as well, right? We've talked about coaches are training athletes' mental dexterity the same as their physical dexterity. So do coaches have a plan for how am I going to train? And so here's my key point: is that for me, the mental strength has not necessarily been trained, although we're getting better at this as these concepts filter down through training and development levels. But mental strength, for the most part, especially historically, and I would still argue to this day, is present in athletes not because it's been trained, but because it's been a natural cut point. They've either had it or they didn't. And those that didn't have it didn't make it. Right. So mental strength is typically there and is typically over indexed, I would say, in athletes that have accomplished certainly the professional level, but even at a probably a semi professional level. Mental endurance, a little bit of the same story there, that probably the level of endurance that you need to persist in your task is going to have been trained in accidentally just by nature of you persisting and being able to make it to that level of sport. And then to skip one, to go to resilience, that's become a popular topic lately. And so, again, to get to a certain level, some resiliency is necessary. I would say the one that has suffered typically on that journey to elite, and the one that I typically focus on, is flexibility. So, and the example, you say, well, what is mental flexibility? So the example that I'll use, this is common in American sport. I don't know how common it is across the pond, but there's the idea that, I'll run through a wall for coach. Whatever coach says, I'll run through the wall. And so great mental strength, great persistence, go run through the wall, bang your head against the wall until you create a hole in the wall. Mental flexibility is, okay, cool, but there's a door over there. Could you use that? There's a window over there. Could you use that? So it's the ability to step back and understand, well, what's the objective here? Is there a better way to accomplish that objective that, still accomplishes the objective? And, sometimes there's a trade-off. Sometimes opening the door causes other people to come in, and that creates a problem for different parts of your teammates. But the idea is that mental flexibility gives you that perspective to step back and not just be mindlessly committed to one pathway, but to be able to observe what options are available and then be able to, I would say, mindfully choose what will be most effective in a given circumstance.
So let me ask you this. Are you finding yourself? I've actually got two questions here. Are you therefore finding yourself in your work more preoccupied with that mental flex, more so than strength, endurance, and resilience? That's quite a broad question, but I'm interested. And my second question is, because strength, endurance, flex, resilience are, for me, athletes are quite socialized into the notion of physical strength, physical endurance, physical flex, physical resilience. Would exploring these in depth, do you find sometimes that exploring these in depth creates a little bit of a fear in athletes around perhaps the potential to overthink these, to overly intellectualize this side of the game?
Yeah, well, so I'll try and take those in order a little bit, and maybe the first answer will provide some insights into the second. So the first one, so I don't know the answer to the first question. I would say experientially, what I've learned is that because of the mechanisms that I described
Yeah,
earlier, that athletes tend to be over-indexed on strength, tend to be pretty finely tuned on endurance,
yeah.
um, probably a little under-indexed on resilience, and way under-indexed on flexibility. And so, again, the analogy I use is physically, if you're over-indexed on strength and under-indexed on flexibility, what's going to happen? Injury is you're set up for a physical injury. And so I use that same analogy to say it's the same with mentally, right? If you're over indexed on mental strength and under indexed on mental flexibility, you're setting yourself up for a mental injury, a mental health issue to arise. So I said I don't know how to answer your question because I've never worked in a context where people kind of aren't over indexed on mental strength. So what I'm trying to say is that I don't know that mental flexibility is particularly privileged in this hierarchy. I think they're all equally necessary. It's just that through the socialization processes with sport, they tend to be under indexed on flexibility. Now, that being said, I think it is broader than sport because, and I want to be careful here because mindfulness and ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy or acceptance and commitment training, they're not the same thing. And a lot of people use them synonymously. So I consider myself to be a mindfulness based practitioner. I use a lot of ACT philosophy, but I don't necessarily use a lot of ACT technology, meaning their interventions and so forth. I use some, but anyways, I'll introduce ACT here to say that for those that are familiar with ACT, which again is acceptance and commitment therapy or acceptance and commitment training, you would know that the goal of ACT is psychological flexibility. And so I think there is, and again, I don't know that that's because flexibility is privileged. I think it's just because of the way, at least in the U.S., people are socialized towards mental strength, somewhat towards mental resiliency. but really not at all towards mental flexibility or cognitive flexibility. So then to your second question about, a big fear a lot of times for athletes and coaches is that working with a sports psychologist or just having any focus on the mental game will lead to overthinking, will lead to, basically just freezing in the moment, being stuck in your head and all those types of things. And so again, I would suggest that flexibility is the antidote to that. That flexibility allows you to, when it's appropriate to think, when it's necessary to think, when you have time to think, when the context allows for thought, then obviously we want to utilize that, right? Our thinking is one of our most valuable skills as a human race. But it can also be used inappropriately, particularly in fast paced sports where there's a time to deliver. And this kind of gets into the trust aspect of my dope. But when there's a time to deliver, and as we know, cognitive interference is going to interfere with skilled physical performance. So flexibility allows you that space, that skill to be able to step back and understand, is this a time for thought or is this a time for trust, for performance? And even that, right? That's not the way that it works. That's an intellectual process. The skill is being able to go through that in an experiential way rather than an intellectual way. Experiential rather than intellectual.
Fascinating. Let's move on to inspiration. Can you speak a little bit to this part of your model?
Yeah, so the inspiration is, a few kind of more simpler ways that I say it are just having a cause bigger than your sport or performance. So the analogy here is if you're standing over the putt, and you're thinking about this $1 million and how it's going to change my life, and then you add on to that, my whole identity is as a golfer, and who will I be if this putt doesn't go in? That's a setup for failure. Nobody can perform at their best under those circumstances. And so inspiration is, why do I do this thing? What's my cause bigger than myself? What are my values that underpin why I'm engaged in this, how I show up in life, who I want to be as a person? And then the performance becomes just one aspect of who you are. One area where you have the opportunity, this is kind of the reframe that I use through inspiration, is one area where you have the opportunity to express and explore who you want to be as a person. So it's not about proving who you are as a person. It's an opportunity to express and learn in that domain and using your values to underpin that. And so basically it's a way of taking perspective, keeping sport in perspective and understanding that there's a lot more to you than an athlete or performer, and there's a lot more to your life than how you deliver in a particular sporting or performance context.
And so before we get onto the trust piece, it sounds to me that the craft of your approach is knowing where to potentially intervene or where to start a conversation, because it strikes me, and please correct me if you feel I'm wrong here, but it strikes me that if I cover some of the inspiration piece, I might turn down the volume of anxiety and stress, which then might help me flex my attention, have a stronger focus of attention, endure more when it comes to mental processes. It strikes me that inspiration impacts focus.
Yeah, that's my hope, right? Is that these are all interrelated.
Yes.
And so I love how you put that. It's very beautifully put. And it's very similar to, again, if we go into the ACT framework, there's this thing called the hexaflex, right? Which is just a fancy and somewhat tongue-in-cheek way of saying that there's 6 elements to ACT, and that they are all interrelated. And then there's also the notion that ones that are closer to one another on this hexaflex schematic are more closely related than the others. And to your point, that the ACT theory suggests that it doesn't matter where you intervene first, so the ordering is not important. Although it says, and this is sort of an interesting piece that I don't think is super well known, is that it's common in the mental health delivery of ACT to start with the diffusion processes and the acceptance processes. So this idea of how to create space from those problematic intrusive thoughts that are probably leading to some of the mental health experiences of the person. But for well functioning or high functioning individuals, ACT supports actually intervening at more of the values and the committed action side of the hexaflex, which is exactly what you're talking about. And that's where inspiration would map onto, is kind of that, really the values piece. And then the committed action is how do you activate that? How do you behaviorally implement the values that you have underpinning your philosophy?
I'd love you to finally take us through the trust piece.
Yeah, so the trust, this comes a lot from my sports science training and the idea, as we alluded to a little bit earlier, that at the moment of skill execution, you want the body to be able to do what it does and the mind to not be involved. And so, Bill Moore wrote a couple of seminal articles on the science of trust, how to actually the mental skills and the scientific underpinnings for this thing of trust that can feel a little bit squishy, right? So, and Bill Moore, again, very closely related to the Keith Henchin and then Rick McGuire, and they all are related to Bob Rotella in the kind of the coaching tree of sports psychology. And so this was a lot of Bob Rotella's group's work out of Virginia that Bill was part of.
Oh, yes.
Was this idea of developing a scientific approach to trust. And so it's the very simple but very difficult skill of getting your head out of the way and allowing your body to do what you've trained it to do. That's the trust element. The trust is when things are at stake, right? When we tag something as important, our mind wants to take control, which is exactly what you don't want to have happen at the moment of skill execution. So trust is training your mind to trust that we've prepared for this circumstance. Let the body do what it knows how to do. Again, easy to say, easy to talk about, incredibly difficult to do.
Being a former professional golfer, Mark, I think I memorized from Bob Rotella's seminal 1995 book, Golf is Not a Game of Perfect, a certain
Yes.
chapter, I think it was Train It and Trust It or something like that, where
Yes.
he,
Yes.
he very much promoted this notion in golf, at least, of, when you're practicing, practice for the most part in actually trust mode rather than train mode. Of course, there's a time to be in train mode, and obviously this is said in very simplistic tones, but of course there's going to be time for train mode. But actually the vast majority of golfers, if we're talking about a golf context, will simply practice in train mode all the time. I'm working on my swing, and they don't give themselves space to experience trust, and so subsequently go out in the golf course, and of course as soon as you card it out of bounds, which I often did, you start to question your technique, and so naturally your thought process goes to
Mhm.
questioning what's going on rather than just continuing to execute free from too much thought.
Yes, and I mean you've introduced a wonderful concept that I found to be very helpful. Again, for me personally, but also in working with coaches and athletes and performers, is the idea of the trusting mindset, as you said, in contrast to the training mindset. And just to give a brief kind of thumbnail sketch of that, the training mindset a lot of people are familiar with, right? This is the idea that it's analytical. So analytical is
Yes.
breaking things down into parts. It's critical, right? It's looking at what went wrong, as a little bit opposed to when we get into the trusting mindset, what went right. So it's this analytical, breaking down, critical, inward looking, or as a coach, looking at them outwardly, but giving inward focused feedback. Those are all elements of the training mindset. And the trusting mindset, as the listener can probably guess by now, is sort of the inverse of that. So rather than being analytical and breaking things down into parts, it's holistic and looking at large patterns of movements rather than individual patterns of movements, and really not looking at patterns of movements at all, but just really, is it getting, to use golf as an example, is the ball getting to where you want it to go? If so, who cares how it got there? In the trusting mindset, right? Um, Similarly, rather than being critical focused and looking for what went wrong, it's feeling what went right. And it's also a lot more, the training mindset very cognitive, the trusting mindset very experiential. So those are some of the hallmark differences of the two. And as you pointed out, because in almost all sport and performance domains, there's significantly more time spent in training than in competition. So if we call it an 80-20 split, and a lot of times it's even higher than that, then the idea that we're spending 80% of a time in a training mindset and zero time in training in a trusting mindset, and then just expected to adopt a trusting mindset when we're in competition. I mean, any coach or athlete or performer can see that's a setup for failure. And so, exactly as you said, building on the work of Bob Rotella and Bill Moore and others, the idea that you need to spend time in training in the trusting mindset. And that means coaches and athletes and performers all together, right? It doesn't make sense if the athlete has a trusting mindset on, but the coach is giving, technique feedback and so forth. So, yeah, spending time in training in the trusting mindset critical point.
Well, to ask a question around your last point, is that somewhere where you might intervene between coach and players? If you're observing, for example, coaches providing a lot of feedback, knowledge of performance, knowledge of outcomes, based on those data points, is that an area you might intervene around this trusting area that you might have a conversation with the coach and say, well, we really want this player to be in a little bit more of a trusting mode here. Perhaps there's a little bit more, too much information flowing between yourself and the player.
Yeah, for sure. And this is where, as a practitioner, having a background in sports science and particularly in pedagogy has been
Yeah.
so helpful. And so, to even take a step back, and then I'll get to this specific example, but using that sort of pedagogical lens, there's a lot of times. So, for example, one coach in particular that I recall working with was a very offensive minded coach. And so, even when the drill was defensive, he would sort of start out giving feedback on the defensive positioning and the defensive technique, and are they adhering to the defensive philosophy. But inevitably, as the drill would go along, all of a sudden it's like, well, that's a bad shot. Why are we taking that shot? And his feedback focus would switch to what was going on offensively. And so, just helping that coach in particular, but coaches generally be precise with their feedback and have the feedback match the purpose of the drill that's at hand. And we know that coaches are so good at being planful, being mindful, being particular about how they plan out their practices. But then, are the actions during the practice mapping onto that plan? And I think most coaches are pretty aware of that and pretty open to that feedback if they're missing the mark there. And so then to bring in the notion that in addition to having what are the coaching points for this particular drill, just having a note of, is this a training drill or is this a trusting drill? And then having the feedback be, if it's a training drill, yeah, critique their technique, critique their skill, critique their placement, all those types of things. If it's a trusting drill, then as a coach, you're probably just going to step back and not say anything in the moment. Or if you do, it's going to be, just broad brushstrokes feedback, not specific things that are going to draw that attention internal.
It's fascinating. So as I'm listening to you, it's making me think of my background in golf coaching and golf playing and then golf coaching, and having the wonderful opportunity to coach the game that I loved and still love, and to do so at a driving range. And for me, one thing I find when you take a coach's lens is you're so socialized into technique. It's your rod and your staff, essentially. It's everything that
Mm-hmm.
is so much that you love about the game. And I reflect back as a golf coach and having so many books on the technical side of golf, and just the presence of those books is going to orient my attention towards the technical side. And that's not wrong, is it, Mark? It's just that it can skew your
Mm-hmm.
cognitive bias towards that when you're looking for solutions, when you're observing behavior, rather than necessarily considering the internal that's driving that external, or perhaps the performance philosophies that we want players to adopt or adapt to. We're just technique, or tactics. Maybe football, soccer here in England, and across Europe, I find that that coaches rest on tactics. We could say in golf technique, but it may be in football, soccer here in Europe, it's tactics. And so everything becomes, everything's a nail that needs a hammer rather than a multitude of solutions, which bleeds
Mm-hmm.
into the psychosocial sides of the game.
Yeah. Well, and there's such a great parallel here between coaching and sports psychology consulting. So when I was early on in my career, actually had the privilege of working with a very high level Olympic pole vault coach, and he was explaining to me that in pole vaulting, and I'll forget the exact number, but directionally this is correct. There's something like 107 movements that have to be done correctly
Wow.
to pole vault to get
Yeah.
over the bar.
Yeah.
Right now in competition, what matters? That you get over the bar. Right. That's it. And so the trick in coaching is obviously if you're critiquing and giving feedback on 107 movements, the athlete's going to learn zero,
Yeah.
right? And so what your job as a coach is to filter down what are the most critical movements, what are the most critical aspects of this performance for this particular performer, which are probably going to be different than for the next particular performer, and how do you give them feedback on only those targeted elements of the performance to allow the other 107 to click into place, right? And so there's this great term from systems theory, which is the point of highest leverage, right? So if you're down here on the 106 pieces that are not the point of highest leverage, maybe if you can find that 107, so that's the point of highest leverage, and you pull on that lever, and those other 106 snap into place. Now that's a little oversimplified, but that's the idea, right? And the parallel here is with sports psychology. That's exactly what your TOPE is meant to do, right? As I alluded to earlier, again, if we use scientific jargon, there's always going to be a tension between internal validity and external validity, right? So internal validity is, does it explain everything as best as possible? And so then it would have the equivalent of the 107 elements in the theory. External validity is, does it work? Is it useful in practice? And that's where, when I'm training students in this, I say, get it down to 5. And if you can't get it down to 5, get it down to 3. Because that's, it's finding what are those points of highest leverage. And so, that's where focus, inspiration, and trust come into for me. But just to make one final point on this is that, just as you're saying, for coaches, it's very easy to critique athletes and see all the elements of technique that are wrong. It's the easiest thing in the world, and we talk about this all the time in our sports psychology training program. It's the easiest thing in the world as a sports psychology consultant to enter into an environment and just say, well, why are they doing that? That's wrong. That's not right. And have all of these critiques. And that's where, to circle back to the beginning of our conversation, curiosity is so critical, right? Stephen Covey's first seek to understand and then to be understood. So rather than asking, well, why do you do it that way? Trying to frame a critique into a question, it's getting very curious about, hey, I noticed this. Can you tell me more about that? And really activating that curiosity to learn to understand first. And then a lot of times the coach will be a lot more open to hearing, oh, so this is how I've done it, or this is how I plan for it. How do you see it? What's your opinion on that? But if you come in blasting them and, why is it this way? Oh, this could be better. Then, basically you're dead in the water.
I've done that before, Mark. I certainly have. I've
Oh, hey,
experienced that one, and hopefully, I'll never do that again. But we're always striving to learn and improve. Now, look, I'm mindful of your time, but I did have one more question for you. I mean, I've loved unpacking your TOPE, your theoretical orientation to performance excellence. Absolutely fascinating stuff. Mental fitness, FIT, focus, inspiration, and trust. But I know that many listening in, when they think of sports psychology, they'd think confidence and motivation. Those are really two huge words up in lights and red ink underlined when we think of sports psychology. They're not in, well, they're not one of your words, essentially. I mean, do you, are they involved, confidence, motivation? Do you have any, in brief, philosophical approaches there?
Yeah, I love that you picked those two, because I do feel like I have, a somewhat useful approach to each of those. So the first thing, well, not the first thing, but as we know, things are individualized. So again, we'll just say kind of a prototypical or stereotypical way that I'll talk about confidence is, I'll first ask the person, what is confidence? And so if you don't mind playing along, Dan, can I ask you how you would define confidence or think about confidence?
Okay, I think about confidence from the perspective of belief, to perform with belief, to engage in approach behavior.
Okay, great. And so you actually introduced a second element there at the end, which is the approach behavior.
I did.
And so this is brilliant. And again, I'll cite where this comes from. This comes from Russ Harris, who's a great author on making ACT, which can be very complicated and very jargony, very pragmatic. So Russ Harris has a wonderful book called The Confidence Gap. And in The Confidence Gap, he teaches, and it's not him creating this is reality, that there's actually two definitions to confidence. So almost everybody will relate to the first definition, which was the first part of what you said, a thought, a feeling, or a belief that one can do something. Yes. And so it's that cognitive element, that thinking element of confidence. But the second definition of confidence is an action.
Yeah.
And so the idea that confidence is an action, and the action, and if you break down confidence, the Latin root of it, con, is in America here, there's a lot of Spanish bilingualism. So con is with in Spanish.
Yeah.
So the con part of confidence is that idea of with, and then the fidence part is fidere, is the Latin word, which is the same root as fidelity. So this idea of being true to yourself.
Yes.
And so the the word confidence literally means with fidelity to oneself, with truth to oneself,
Yes.
with accuracy to oneself, which is completely in contrast to a notion we promote in America a lot of times, is the idea of fake it till you make it, the idea that you need to be someone other than who you are in order to be confident or to act confident. And so, taking all that together, my philosophical approach to confidence is, number one, it's an action just as much as it is a thought. And obviously, working with performers and athletes, action is much more important than thinking. And then two, it's about bringing who you are to the experience, not trying to put who you are in the background. And I don't mean who you are from an identity perspective, but I mean being true to who you are. And so, and then this brings in an element from my training with Rick McGuire. He talks about that confidence is a choice. And so the first element is that competence, competence makes confidence. So if you're not competent, if you can't do the skill, then why would you be confident? Right. But once you build competence, the skill to be able to deliver, then confidence is, again, it's simply believing in who you are, not who you're not. So developing the skill to be able to deliver leads to the action of confidence, which is being true to yourself. I trained all this week to have this game on Sunday. Now, again, the easy part, the easy way to say it, hard thing to do, is now I just have to show up and do it. That gets into the trust piece. So that's kind of the broad strokes on confidence for me. So the idea, again, that using a mindfulness and an ACT framework, it's not get more in your head. It's not think more confident thoughts. It's not when you have a quote unquote negative thought to counter it with a positive thought, because that's just pulling yourself more into your head, right? And who wants to have more thoughts, right? And so the idea is to be less, with ACT, we talk about holding things loosely. And so it's the idea of holding your thoughts loosely, that, yeah, they're there. And like we talked about earlier, use them when when you need to, and use them when they're helpful. But also recognize that your mind's just going to produce thought, and you don't always have to pay attention to it. And so confidence is the action of saying, you know what, I don't need to be in my head right now. I need to be in my body. Let my body go perform. So that's the confidence piece. The motivation piece, um, an analogy I love here is the idea of crying babies in the middle of the night, or for younger athletes, I'll talk about early morning training. And the idea here is to draw a differentiation between motivation and commitment. And again, from commitment, for those that are familiar with ACT, you'll map that onto committed action, right? Same idea. Um, but what I'm trying to draw is the distinction between motivation, which again, if I ask people to define motivation, a lot of people will go to, it's a feeling, right? It's this feeling of, I'm excited, I'm energized, I want to do this. And what do we know about feelings? They come and go, right? Motivation is going to come and go, right? Whereas committed action is an action. You can perform a committed action whether or not you feel like it. And so this is where I use the crying baby in the middle of the night when I was sort of learning these concepts. I was a young father, and or like I said, if I'm working with young athletes, I'll use the early morning training. But the idea is, when your baby is crying at 2 a.m., are you motivated to go help your baby? Probably not. Are you committed to going and helping your baby? Yeah. And so, I'll joke. People can't see me in person, so I'll just denote that I'm joking here. But yeah, my commitment is, I look to see if my wife is going to get up first, and if she doesn't, then I will. But no, I mean, the reality is, right? None of us are motivated to go help the baby at 2 a.m. But hopefully, we're all committed to going and helping the baby at 2 a.m. Same thing with early morning training, right? The alarm goes off at 4 a.m. Are you motivated to jump out of bed and go practice? Yeah, maybe every once in a while, but certainly not every time. Are you committed to getting out of bed and going to practice? If so, that's an action that you can take rather than waiting for a feeling to allow for that action state to happen.
I love everything you said, and I want to reflect back two things to you. One is a statement, the other one is a question to close things out. When I heard you speak about your definition or your thoughts around confidence, it made me think of this: that confidence is attained, potentially attained, by looking for evidence of what you are able to embody and enact. What you said to me very much resonates with me from an action perspective. I'm very much into researching and looking into what we might describe as embodied cognition, that our mental processes are embodied. And I think very much getting into the
Mm-hmm.
body, into our environment, how our a body enacts on its environment, I think is very, very important. To have conversation, even just conversations around that, or to ask athletes to explore things around that, I think is really interesting when it comes to the building and maintenance of confidence. And then just the final question for today, and the question I had around motivation was this. So therefore, would you potentially see motivation as more affective and commitment as more cognitive?
So I would agree with the first part, motivation more affective. How I think about it, again, if we had a bunch of motivation researchers here, they would push back at that notion. But in my experience, that's how a lot of people, I'll just say people that I work with, athletes, that's how they think about it, right? Do I feel ready to go or not? So affective,
Yeah,
to your point,
yeah,
right? Now, I would not say that I consider commitment to be cognitive.
uh, I agree. Yeah,
I would say I consider it to be an action. Again, that's the ACT language, right? And so, yeah, there's a cognitive component to that. But what I would say, and again, from an ACT framework, is it's rooted in your values. And so it's connecting with your values and then choosing what's the next action that allows me to enact, to behaviorally activate a value. And so one of the things that I'll explore with athletes is the inspiration. Why do you do what you
yeah,
do? And, a lot of times they'll say, well, I love the game. And I'll say, why? What do you love about the game? And so what I'm trying to drill down to is what are the values that underpin that? So there's a lot of different ways you can love the game. You can love to play the game aggressively. You can love to play the game violently. You can love to play the game passionately. You can love to play the game considerately. You can love to play the game ethically. So what's the value that underpins how you want to do? And then commitment is just enacting that
yeah,
value on a ongoing basis.
yeah. So it could, in essence, be the antithesis of what I've said. That commitment actually dials down cognition, mental processes, and dials up action.
Well, I think I might get the author on this wrong. I think it's Stephen Hayes, who is the founder of
Yes.
ACT.
Yeah.
But one of his books is actually called "Get Out of Your Head and Into Your Life."
Yeah. Of
And so,
course.
yeah, I think that is the ACT perspective of it's not about what you're
Yeah.
thinking; it's
Yeah.
about what you do.
Mark, what a fascinating conversation. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you so much. I greatly enjoyed it. I appreciate the questions and the dialogue.
I know that you will have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. So, for those people who want to find you and follow you, where can people find you online and potentially follow you in your work?
Well, it's a bit of a slippery one. I like to fly under the radar a little bit. I do have a Twitter. I believe it's at Mark Aoyagi. One of the nice things about having a unique name is I think you just get the name. You don't have to have the ones and the dashes and so forth. So I believe that's correct. I had a blog that I did a long time ago, pre kids, and then it died when I had kids, ironically. But that's out there. I think it's wordpress.markaoyagi.com, I think. Um, and then I'm kind of old school. I'm not a social media person, as you're probably getting from this. So I suppose email. I'm mark.aoyagi@du.edu.
Fantastic. Mark, thank you so much for today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. If you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.